Hi all, very nice to meet you, or some of you I met, those who haven't, nice to meet you, so to speak, for the first time. Uh, Here to talk about cognitive health. I think many of us would agree, arguably, the most important asset you have, at least from my perspective. There's a lot of other things we can do to augment performance, but if the brain's not working for the most part, most of us would agree, that's kind of the definition of health span. You don't have that, you don't have anything. Before I get into it too much, a little bit of background on myself. So, Orel Swenson, I'm an ER doctor by training. Went to SUNY Upstate Medical, Syracuse, New York, trained as an emergency medicine doctor and practiced for about 7 years after residency. Like a lot of ER doctors, burned out substantially. Really found that the quality of life was terrible with all the shift work and all the associated stress. So transitioned out of emergency medicine and kind of began my journey in the regenerative space for myself. I got into regenerative longevity medicine, trying to get better for myself, sleeping better, losing weight as I left emergency medicine, and went back to school, got a business degree, thinking I was going to leave healthcare in perpetuity, but as is often the case, things don't go the way you plan. So people started coming to me interested in what I had been doing for myself. That blossomed into a small side hustle in regenerative medicine that then led to where I am now with respect to Aonic Health. Focus areas for the Aonic Health Clinic are cognitive health, physical performance, and also on the side, sexual health. From my perspective, the three pillars that most people define as critical to a high quality of life. So, a little overview of what we're going to talk about for the rest of the day here. Some basic definitions of cognitive health that might be relevant to us. We're going to touch on brain aging, normal versus accelerated brain aging, what it should look like when you're young, what happens as you get older, and some of the pathological events that happen that cause the kind of aging we all fear versus what we like to experience. We'll then get fairly deep on lifestyle interventions. I know we've heard it 1,000 times, but it's important to cover that because 80-20 rule, no matter what we do, if the lifestyle parts are not optimized, you're not going to get the benefit of any of your regenerative interventions. In that space, we'll also talk briefly about the gut-brain axis, and perhaps less commonly discuss the mouth-brain axis, essentially oral hygiene as well, and how that pertains to brain aging. Call out just for you, I promise. We'll get into some genetic considerations, the things that you can't change, but what you can potentially do about them. And then we'll get into how we actually measure objectively cognitive health, the therapeutic interventions that are out there. We'll wrap up with some of the more novel technology, where we'll hand it over to Dr. Todd at that point. All right. So terminology that all of you should have heard in the past, but a quick refresher, right? Executive function is what we commonly think of as, the most important part, high-level thinking. It's a bit of a catch-all term, so I've somewhat arbitrarily put inhibition, cognitive flexibility, and reasoning under this area. Inhibition, can you suppress distractions and stay focused on your task at hand? Cognitive flexibility, something of a misnomer that we sometimes refer to as multitasking. It's not. It's can you switch gears very quickly to the next one while suppressing whatever you were working on beforehand. And then, of course, reasoning is being able to reason through new creative problems. Attention, very similar to inhibition. Can you focus on the task at hand for a long period of time? Processing speed. Processing speed is just what it sounds like. You can have all the neurons that you want, but if the myelin sheaths are degrading, you can't think quickly, you can't reach conclusions very quickly. Early in life, you also lack processing speed, and we'll get into why and how that develops over time and how it subsequently degrades. And then memory, right? Working memory, that's like when you check the rear view mirror, the car's there, not there, you can shift lanes, you forget about that instantaneously. Short-term memory, what you've got in your mind for several minutes. I can remember the phone number, write it down for a moment. Maybe I can remember a little bit of my conversation this morning. And then long-term memory is declarative. Declarative is facts and figures. And procedural, how do you do things from usually, how do you drive, how do you write, etc. So with that said, early in life, where does brain aging begin? Or what happens, early in life with respect to brain development versus brain aging? We often recognize that children, slow thought process, not very high executive function, takes them a long time to make major decisions. Not accounting for anything, of course, with respect to hormones and decision-making and all that. What you can think of is an analogy of city streets. When you're very young, you have a plethora of synapses between many, many different nerves. You can get to any street and any destination in that city. Every nerve has the opportunity to talk to every other one. Of course, we're being a little bit facetious, but that's about what you can envision. That makes for a great pathway if you don't know where you need to go just yet, like a child learning new thoughts, new memories, etc. You don't know which roads are the most important, so you want to be able to get everywhere. But you're stopping at every light, you're taking wrong turns, you're going back and forth. You don't have very emphasized synaptic connections that say, all right, we can go from here to here on the following highway. Over time, you reinforce the destinations that are most important. We're going to take out these lights. We're going to build roads. We're going to enforce these synapses and cut those. And you build highways that allow you to get from destination to destination, allow you to have faster thoughts than you did when you were a child, at the cost of these highways are cutting through your city, so to speak. Now, if you have to learn something new, you don't have as many synapses left over to remodel with. You've got to find an exit. You've got to modify the highway. Theoretically, this peaks in efficiency sometime in our 30s, where we've trimmed all our synapses, strengthened all our highways, have the most efficient connections we're going to have in life. And at that point, and from that point forward, we usually see degradation. It was previously thought that brain aging was a very unilateral process. What I mean by that, is that we didn't continue to grow nerves and synapses. We now know that's not true whatsoever. It's just the rate of growth that slows. So neurogenesis, new nerve growth, and synaptic plasticity continues throughout life. It's just a matter of efficiency. So you've built your highways, you have a functioning brain, you're somewhere in your 30s or 40s, and now what? Well, ideally, we can all think of people in their 80s, their 90s who remain super sharp, right? Functioning just as they were when they were at the peak of their career, whatever it might be. And that is, by definition, normal aging. That synaptic pruning has occurred, okay? We've lost some synaptic plasticity. And as we get a little older, okay, the highways aren't quite as good as they used to be. There's a little bit of loss of myelin. You have a little bit less efficiency in terms of how fast you get from A to B. You can't learn something quite as fast, but everything works pretty darn well. Everything's still in place the way we want it to be. And for the most part, you don't overall notice much beyond some mild cognitive impairment. In contrast, then, and what we all fear, is pathological aging. The highways are destroyed. You've lost substantial amounts of neurons. You've lost your myelin sheaths. You can't get from place to place. The synapses are not there. Even if the neurons are, they're not functioning. The neurotransmitter levels are off or inappropriately regulated. No matter how you cut it, now you're not getting the messages across. Not only are you not forming new memories, you've lost some of your old ones. You've lost things that we define you as a person. When we get into Alzheimer's, we get into Parkinson's, and you've lost the motor skills. You've lost the ability to recall or to have executive function. This is what's happening. So what's the difference between somebody who's had what we hope to be healthy brain aging and those who have pathological aging? At the core of that is inflammation, and there's a plethora of causes which we'll touch on, as well as neurotransmitter disruption. Inflammation leads to loss of the neurons through either dysfunction or death, and neurotransmitter dysfunction means that even if you've got all the roads, you don't have any cars. You can't get the message across regardless. All right, and those are the things that we try to avoid and can avoid, or at least mitigate substantially through lifestyle interventions, and more so, and at this point now, with regenerative medicine interventions as well. Broadly speaking, then, what are the mechanisms that are causing cognitive decline, neuronal loss, et cetera? So there's oxidative stress. Reactive oxygen species damage DNA, damage mitochondria, damage your ability to function as a neuron correctly, leading to neuronal death and damage. Okay, loss of lipids damages the ability of the nerve to appropriately regulate the passage of neurotransmitters and calcium and all sorts of other things through, so you're getting missignaling if the nerve still survives. Loss of the myelin sheath. If you guys can remember, right, myelin allows the nerve signal to jump down the synapse rather than walk slowly down it, but as that degrades over time, you have slowed processing speeds. Chronic inflammation and scarring. So inflammation itself activates microglial cells. Microglial cells are one of the core immune cells unique to the brain. Under normal circumstances, they help in not just immune reactions, but cleaning up tau proteins and other problems, so we believe. Their overactivation leads to no different than any other overactivation systemically of an inflammatory cascade in the brain that further damages the nerves themselves. And then, as I touched on before, neurotransmitter disruption. Loss of the neurotransmitters means no matter, even if everything else is going well, and of course none of these things are ever happening in isolation, but even if everything else is going well, you're not effectively controlling the signaling cascade that you want to get across. So some examples of this, right? Dopamine decline. Dopamine decline, we think of motor control, executive function, the shaking, and everything else. As a brief sidebar, we'll talk about and we'll touch on things like Parkinson's and Alzheimer's disease, and we'll talk about leaky gut, and we'll talk about irritable bowel syndrome. However, the misnomer of traditional medicine, we'll say nomenclature, is that we think of these diseases in isolation. But you can also think of an 80-year-old man or woman who has a little bit of shaking in their hands. Certainly don't have Parkinson's disease, but this is what we're experiencing. It's much more important to begin to appreciate that you're looking at a slow decline and a spectrum of illness, not absolutes. And to that end, we're trying to slow that decline, even if you don't get to that disease state historically. So again, dopamine and motor control, acetylcholine, impaired memory. You don't have to have Alzheimer's to have impaired memory. We've all seen people like that as well. Just a shift in thinking from, again, absolute disease, so to speak, to relative disease. So that brings us to lifestyle. And we're going to spend a good chunk of time here. I know lifestyle is a big topic no matter what we do when it comes to everything in the longevity, health span, regenerative space, but there's a reason for that. All right? And then the analogy I go to using the cars on the highway is you can put NOS in the car, but if the car is all busted, you're still going to only go so fast. You can use all the regenerative medicine techniques there are. You can use the V-cell laser, but if at the core you're augmenting a system that's dysfunctional, you're not going to maximize your full potential. It's important to understand exactly what's happening from your lifestyle decisions that are going to limit how much effectively help you can get. So as cool and as sexy certain techniques may sound, if you're ignoring this, you're not going to get very much out of it. And with that, I start with sleep. The one thing that we all are always lacking, myself included. I can speak to this from our recent travel. Dr. Todd, it sounds like, had a similar experience a couple days ago as we got in. I always start with sleep when it comes to any potential client of mine. Don't know if this is the right slide. Oh, yeah, it just didn't show up right, sorry. So I always start with sleep because, in my opinion, it's foundational for everything else we'll try to do from a lifestyle perspective. If you're not sleeping correctly, you're not going to be able to, so we started this all over again, I'm sorry. We're going to talk about building muscle. We're going to talk about gut health. We're going to talk about oral hygiene health. We're going to talk about exercise, right? If you're not sleeping, you don't see any of those benefits at all. That is to say, you can't build muscle when you don't sleep. Your inflammation cascade is worse. You're at an elevated cortisol level at all times. Your gut health is out of whack because you're releasing the wrong hormones or not regulating them accordingly. Additionally, sleep has a lot of primary benefits. Now, interestingly, sleep is one of those things that we still only kind of understand. We get what it does. We have a better understanding than we did even a few years ago. We don't have the full picture of why sleep is so unbelievably important and why we developed to require it versus, so to speak, running these operations during the day. There's a lot of hypotheticals around it that I'm not going to get into. One of the biggest things that happen during sleep is activation of the lymphatic system. Okay, you may have heard of lymphatic system. This is very akin to that. Your CSF is passing through and being cleaned of, as far as we understand it, inflammatory markers, reactive oxygen species, all these proteins and whatnot that are at least linked to, if not causative of Alzheimer's, dementia, and other degradation. It doesn't happen when you don't sleep, or at least it doesn't happen efficiently. Memory consolidation. Anybody who's gone a night without sleeping knows they don't remember yesterday very well, knows they're not making good memories that day and performing the way they'd like to. Year after year of this has a substantial taxing effect. Without going too far down the rabbit hole, but just for the sake of touching on it, the different stages of sleep, and the reason that we always hammer, are you getting enough deep sleep, REM sleep, this sleep, is because they all serve different functions. And I've just limited this to memory beyond other functions that your different sleep stages serve as well. Non-REM sleep, as you can see, right, declarative memory, spatial and motor skills. REM sleep is the fun one, though. So procedural and emotional memory, but also creativity and problem solving, known as associative memory. This is, oh, I went to bed, I woke up, I had a brand new idea. During REM sleep, you are identifying new and novel connections. As you decide, you don't decide, of course, but as your brain decides, which synapses to keep, which ones to prune, it identifies new connections that maybe you didn't have the night before, quite literally. And so when you wake up with that new idea, it's not just in your head. I mean, it is in your head, but it actually happened. And then lack of sleep, again, as I was mentioning, even with one night, we all know this, right? We're moody, we're crabby, we don't have good emotional control, we don't remember things as well. I mean, one night without sleep has been linked to higher accident rates than drinking and driving in terms of cognitive impairment and motor skill impairment. you can, of course, appreciate year after year of this and what it must do to you going through med school, residency, etc. Can't be bad for you at all. So this is fundamental from my perspective because everything else kind of comes from this. Nutrition. Again, I know we've all heard this before, but there's a reason we hammer these primary, we'll call it lessons, so to speak. So omega-3 fatty acids, you've heard of all the time. We're talking about fatty fish, we're talking about flaxseed, we're talking about walnuts. Quick caveat here. These are pseudo-arbitrary categorizations, right? Antioxidants and omega-3s in terms of what their mechanisms are. There's a lot of overlap in these. This is just meant to give you some subjective way to kind of look at it. So omega-3 fatty acids is very important in maintaining neuronal membrane fluidity. What does that mean? It's when we're talking about, can I regulate the calcium, the neurotransmitters, et cetera, appropriately coming back and forth through the nerve membrane. Without that, we have misfiring, we have miscommunication. Too much or too little is still a problem. Myelin sheath integrity, as referenced earlier, with respect to how myelin helps with processing speeds. And they have anti-inflammatory effects. Antioxidants, there are many of them. Vitamin C and E are particularly interesting. Not only do they scavenge reactive oxygen species, so these are natural byproducts that bounce around, damage the DNA, damage RNA, damage mitochondria, and cause damage to the function of the cell. They're also important in contributing to vascular health. In particular, they help support the collagen elastase that maintains vascular integrity. We'll get into this a little more, but as a reminder, your brain sucks up about 20% of your blood flow, about 25% of your oxygen. That number can increase to 50% at sleep when you're doing nothing else whatsoever. A robust vascular system is pretty darn important, which will, of course, lead into exercise as well. B vitamins support energy metabolism, linked to homocysteine. Homocysteine is another inflammatory marker that causes, ironically, a higher risk of vascular issues as well as other cognitive impairments. All right, who's heard of the gut-brain axis? I'd like to think almost everyone. Show of hands. All right, good. Everybody convinced that it's important at this point, more or less? Anybody think it's not important? Anybody know what it actually means or is in reference to? Comfortable? Somewhat comfortable?
Like the constant connection between the brain and your stomach.
Perfect. Anything else? Perfect. Vagus nerve. Anything else? You ever heard of GALT? Gut-associated lymphatic tissue? Okay, so getting into this, right? You ever eat bad? Whatever it was, it doesn't matter. Had a bad day eating, drinking. You wake up, you don't feel so good. And you think, oh, okay, I feel guilty because I ate all sorts of crappy food. It's not that you feel guilty. I mean, it might be as well, but it's not just that you feel guilty. Even transient bad choices, so to speak, and again, we all indulge in everything, even transient bad choices affect the gut microbiome to the point that they can have direct impact that day on mood, on neurotransmitters, on cognitive performance, and everything else. The way to think about it, so this is probably a little bit overdone word-wise, I apologize. The way I think about the gut-brain axis is several-fold. Firstly, there's the enteric nervous system. The enteric nervous system is the gut's own nerve system. It operates, I would say, pseudo-independently. It's helping with peristalsis, moving things through, but it's always in contact through the vagus nerve with the brain. Okay? It's how you can feel inflammation, how you can feel bloated and not feel very good. Then there's the gut bacteria themselves, the gut microbiome. Those are important, of course, because they produce and contribute substantially to many factors that impact brain health directly. For instance, about 90% of serotonin in your body is made in the gut. So too, substantial amounts of GABA and dopamine are made there. Now, that said, much of this will never cross the blood-brain barrier and impact it directly. But all the same, because of the impact on the enteric nervous system and because of systemic processes and through the vagus nerve, you're getting signals to the brain substantially through through changes in those levels at the gut level. Remember to keep in mind that neurotransmitters are not just neurotransmitters. They often have effects far beyond that. So when we think about these leaking out of the gut being available systemically, they're going to have different impacts downstream. Loss of the integrity of your gut microbiome affects the production of many of these neurotransmitters. The affecting of the neurotransmitters also affects production of short-chain fatty acids, such as butyrate. These are critical for maintaining blood-brain barrier integrity. They also are energy sources of the brain itself. Again, many things are produced by the gut itself. So we got the gut, we've got the enteric nervous system. Then we have the actual lining, so to speak, that are cells, okay? That can be damaged too by changes in your diet. So here's what happens. You eat bad, you have an inflammatory reaction because you've disrupted the gut microbiome, you've irritated the lining of the gut, and so now you have some degree of what's somewhat misnomer called leaky gut. What that means in English is we've lost the barriers that are stopping toxins and inflammatory particles from crossing into the bloodstream. If it crosses into the bloodstream, it's going to interact with the nervous system directly, indirectly, or otherwise, and trigger downstream inflammatory cascades, putting you at risk for metabolic syndrome. You hear metabolic syndrome, you think diabetes. Again, misnomer for the sake of absolute definitions. Think more of spectrum, ongoing inflammation leading to downstream damage. So those are probably the three biggest areas of how gut health can be substantially impacting on cognitive performance. And in the long term, what that leads to is a generalized inflammatory state that leads to activation of microglial cells, which has subsequent impacts on inflammation within the brain itself, neurological damage, DNA damage, etc. And again, it doesn't take much, right? You have a couple bad days of diet and exercise, most of us can feel the difference quite literally in how we're performing. You do that for years and years, and the effects just stack up. So gut-brain axis, gut health has gotten a pretty good amount of attention lately, thankfully. I think there's a growing awareness around how this impacts us, but often overlooked is oral hygiene and health. This crowd might be an exception. Most of you have probably heard something to this effect. How many of you are fairly aware of the impact of the oral microbiome on cognitive health? 1, 2, 3. Oh, less than I thought. Okay. So this is not your fault. This is the fault of the medical system, quite frankly. We still have dentists, and I'm not knocking dentists. What I say is we still have dentists as if they are a separate part of the body than everything else, which is not true. And we often treat it that way, and we treat it in isolation. We've acknowledged for some years now that a poor oral hygiene, high periodontal disease increases your risk of vascular disease. We're finally lighting up the fact that it increases your risk of cognitive decline as well. If you think about the mouth being no more than an extension of the gut, at least in the gut you have this, though it may not be pretty to think about, wall of bacteria as an extra barrier. You don't have that here. Everything that's in your mouth is exposed to a hugely vascular environment that can effectively get in quite simply and quite quickly. So ongoing inflammation very readily translates into inflammation throughout the body from the mouth. A couple other unique ones that are coming out. So flossing. Anybody hear the new stat about flossing and Alzheimer's disease? So there's some statistics out there suggesting that regular daily flossing decreases your risk of Alzheimer's dementia by as much as 70%. Just flossing. Yeah, just 70%. And conversely, they've seen people who have high P. gingivalis loads carrying a 50% increased risk. Again, early data, but clearly a substantial impact regardless for something that we can affect quite quickly. P. gingivalis, the name is fairly self-evident in terms of what we associated it with. Well, the toxin that it leaks, and I say toxin for the sake of simplicity, so gingipanes leaks in, can actually cross through the blood-brain barrier, interact with tau proteins. Tau proteins are associated with some forms of dementia. It serves and works as a protease, so it cuts and disrupts the protein. It disrupts the tau protein, which subsequently allows it to, let's call it, strangle the neuron. Again, not quite what's happening, but the disrupted tau protein is now substantially disrupting neurotransmitter action and triggering an inflammatory cascade as well. And then, again, blood-brain barrier disruption through the release of other endotoxins, just like we get from the gut health, leading to a substantial inflammatory state. The other one to touch on, and this will lead into exercise when we get there in a minute, is, as I mentioned, poor oral hygiene is very highly linked to cerebrovascular disease, vascular dementia, all from a spectrum from that perspective. So, exercise and cognitive health. Who's here to, I'd like to think most of you have heard of BDNF. All right, maybe. So brain-derived neurotrophic factor. I'm going to bury the lead on this one a little bit and lead it to Dr. Todd to get into substantially more. In short, it's one of many agents that, in this case, promotes neurogenesis and promotes synaptic plasticity. You can increase it through regular aerobic activity. Current literature suggests about 150 minutes a week is the target. At least from what we know so far, those numbers, as most of you probably are aware, are usually a bit of a moving target. Aerobic exercise is good for you, should be the take-home method here, increasing that BDNF. Interestingly, strength training is also very important for cognitive health from a slightly different perspective. So one, it increases IGF-1, insulin-like growth factor 1, which just generally is linked to angiogenesis, new blood vessels, and neurogenesis. Two, improves insulin sensitivity. Again, getting to the idea that metabolic disease is a spectrum, right? More muscle mass improves your insulin sensitivity. That's a good thing. You want less glucose floating around, decreasing your risk of generalized inflammatory states. And supposedly enhances your cognitive function. And the reason that my suspicion, Dr. Chai, I wonder if you have a different thought when you get up here. My suspicion for why that seems to be true is you can get on a bike, you can go for a run, and pretty much zone out, which is fine. There's nothing wrong with doing that. When you're lifting weights, if you're doing it deliberately, you are quite literally engaging cerebrally in terms of what am I pushing on, pulling on, form, etc. So it's still contributing to a more deliberate engagement of the brain versus the more passive ones that you see with aerobic exercise. So far, so good. Any questions?
Are you saying exercise needs to be done with intention?
It does seem that way, yeah. I wasn't really sure what happens for the guy who sits on a bike while reading a book. I feel like they get a double benefit there, so. All right. Education and cognitive training. So lifelong learning. Lifelong learning is good for you. Lifelong learning decreases your risk of dementia, it decreases your risk of cognitive decline. Now, sidebar, right, most people that have access to lifelong learning are also in higher socioeconomic brackets. There's a lot of complications around that. We're not going to touch on that, not to be rude about it, but we're going to touch on what I can get to from this perspective. As far as we understand it, okay, like any muscle, so to speak, you want to train your brain to continue to either prune and or reinforce new synapses, and you want to give it a reason to do so. Targeted cognitive training. So this is when you just do memory-based tasks or reflex-based training. Is it good for you? There's a lot of companies out there trying to show that it is beneficial to you, and it's questionable. What I mean by that is it's unclear if targeted training will generalize to cognitive health overall because you're just reinforcing, theoretically, one particular task. If all you do is the New York Times word cross every single morning, you might be really good at word association, but has that helped you strengthen any other synapse out there? In contrast, what we really want to target, we know with confidence is beneficial to you, is broad cognitive training. Things that make you do more than one thing at once, like learning a new language and how to write it and how to pronounce it, which is triggering vocal cords, plus motor skills, plus learning, and usually social skills in the process because you don't learn a language in isolation. Or music and learning a new instrument, quite complicated, right? The idea is that what we're trying to do is extend those side streets, so to speak, for as long as possible. Give your brain a reason to keep building them versus just relying on the existing highways. And part of the idea behind it is if the highway breaks, but you've built enough side streets, you have enough other synapses, you have a way to reinforce them if and when the time comes. Say you have a small stroke in an area, or just, again, with the spectrum of vascular disease, do you have effectively cognitive reserve to work around that? And that's a large part of where we believe cognitive training comes into slowing your aging process or slowing cognitive aging. All right, so that was the lifestyle stuff. Questions on that at all? I can't see too well, so shout out or...
Thank you for that. I do have one question. If you saw any studies regarding benefits from mind-body integration exercises, and which would be those? It links to your intentionality remark about exercise.
So I haven't seen ones as it pertains to looking into cognitive health. I may be mistaken if you're talking about ones where you're deliberately engaging muscle and this and that as you're doing exercise. And I apologize if I misunderstood you. I have not, what I've seen for data is it does not seem to impact muscle growth or other changes. I don't know as much as it pertains to cognitive changes. And again, if anybody's asking questions, I can't see you, so we'll just keep going for now. Oh. All right. So genetic factors, measuring performance, and some of our regenerative medicine tools. Why do we care about genetic factors if we can't do much about them? Well, the fact is we can, or at least we can do more aggressive lifestyle interventions. We don't have much going on today that we can, actively change from the genetic perspective, but there's much to know here. So ApoE4, I suspect many people have heard of. It's gotten a lot of press lately, right? Apolipoprotein epsilon 4 variant increases your risk of Alzheimer's disease substantially. You're born with it. There's nothing you can do about it, except be very deliberate and proactive in anti-inflammatory diets and things that would otherwise accelerate cognitive decline. ApoE2 is a protective variant that's out there. The MTHFR gene, you guys can pronounce that at your leisure, impacts folate metabolism. And disrupted folate metabolism leads to elevated homocysteine levels. Homocysteine, if you remember from slightly earlier in the talk, leads to a higher risk of cardiovascular disease, which, again, problematic for cognitive health and decline. You can overcome that by appropriate supplementation. The COMT gene, impacts dopamine degradation. This one's an interesting one because both too much and too little dopamine can be problematic. So bromocriptine, for instance, has been utilized to attempt to impact dopamine levels with very limited success because we don't have a great way of telling how much you actually need. Varies from person to person. BDNF, brain-derived neurotrophic factor. Some variants are just less potent than others, genetically speaking. So what do? You prioritize an aerobic exercise routine if you're aware that you have variants like that. And of course, there are other tools that we'll get into soon. Kebra T carriers, this is one you might want to have. Kidney brain protein carriers, enhanced synaptic plasticity. C carriers, a relatively poor one. Again, this might promote somebody to be more aggressive in cognitive education early on in life, be very deliberate about it to try to offset some of this. Measuring cognitive performance. So in a hospital setting, the kind of default tools, and there are much more than I have on the list here, are the Montreal Cognitive Assessment, the MoCA and the Mini MoCA, as well as the Minty Mental Statics exam. These are broadly applicable, that is, they're easy to use, easy to administer relatively, but they're not helpful for the masses, so to speak, when we think about people who are generally performing well and we're looking for very subtle changes. This is more meant to pick up somebody who's already showing signs of degradation. You're late to the game at this point. That brings us to what we're seeing now in terms of computerized testing. So CNS vital signs, Creos, and I have no disclosures for any of these, are companies that allow for much more subtle testing that can pick up early cognitive decline, smaller changes in terms of your short-term, long-term performance, and can be administered very regularly from quite literally the comfort of your home on a computer. And then a very interesting one that we might have access to here, pending, is the NeuroCatch. So this is an EEG-based means of monitoring performance, particularly how fast your processing speed is going. Now, they're able to extrapolate from that processing speed a lot of other factors from it, but in short, it's an EEG-based means of monitoring processing speed. That should be very in tune with subtle changes and helpful if you too undertake any of the cognitive programs that we'll talk about later today. I do apologize, this slide is not showing up how I hoped, so sorry for that one. Some of the kind of go-to regenerative medicine tools, including tools that we have here, are nootropics. So nootropics are many of the supplements that have been shown to have, let's call it an outsized impact on cognitive health. There are many more than I lifted up here. Alpha-GPC increases acetylcholine, improves memory. L-theanine, useful for those who have anxiety issues. It interacts and slows alpha brain waves, so improves your relaxation while simultaneously improving focus. Modafinil, not technically a nootropic, previously used for narcolepsy and those who have sleep cycle disturbances from shift work, has also been found to increase dopamine and norepinephrine levels, increasing wakefulness. Ironically, not everybody needs to be more awake. Modafinil does not always benefit people. Some find themselves underperforming and or anxious as a result of it, so it's not always a go-to. Peptides, there are, again, many, but the ones that I'll go to here, skipping deliberately BDNF for the moment. C-Link, this is one that affects GABA and serotonergic systems. Also helps with stress response. So the use of certain peptides in regenerative medicine, the use of different nootropics, in short, are really based on your cognitive picture. It's not enough to say, I want to perform better cognitively. I want to know, are you anxious? Are you able to focus? On top of all this lifestyle stuff, of course, that we try to address as well. We'd want to understand just what's causing you, are you distractible? Are you not distractible and you can't switch gears to a new task? Are you hyper-focused on problems? Growth hormone-releasing peptides, so sermorelin, CJC1295, and many others, have more global effects with respect to how they support neuroplasticity and new nerve growth. And then NAD, cut off, but most of you have heard of NAD? Okay. So NAD, very beneficial for enhancing ATP production, improves the efficiency of the function of the neurons. And then pushing the edge, so to speak, is now exosomes. You can get exosomes today. They are of benefit, to be sure. Where they are going, though, is that exosomes, more importantly, easily cross the blood-brain barrier and so can be thought of as a carrier platform. We hope to be able to, and of course currently research is in that direction already, modify exosomes to load them with certain changes, whether that's new RNA, whether that's particular factors, etc. Okay? ACTP or stem cell therapy, depending on where you're coming from and what the regulatory guidelines are requiring you to call it and how it qualifies. Okay? There's a number of these. I'm going to bury this one for the most part, as Dr. Todd's going to get into this, I'm sure, in some detail. But embryonic is the one that faces the most significant pushback with respect to ethical considerations. Mesenchymal stem cells, pluripotent or induced pluripotent, those that we take from you and try to get them to reach pluripotency again. And these have the potential to drive true neuronal regrowth as they secrete nootropic factors. And that's about a wrap from my perspective. Okay, so like I said, lifestyle factors at the core. Hopefully this has given you some insight as to why all the bolt-ons, all the regenerative medicine tools can accelerate and help. But if you've missed the 80%, you're still not going to get to where you want to be. Again, kind of the philosophy, right? Optimize what you have in control before you maximize by using additional agents. And with that, QR code for the for my website, I apologize. And any questions? Fire away.
Psychedelics
Yes.
also increase BDNF signaling. Oh, okay. Hey, now.
Hello.
Hey, I'm Max. So psychedelics, they also increase BDNF and things like that seem to add to neuroplasticity, but you didn't mention them as a lifestyle intervention. How do you think about it? How do you feel about it in the context of brain health?
Yeah, I think the data around psychedelics is actually quite robust, but it's not an area that I focus in and play in. I have partners on my team that I turn to for that. So that's the short answer, to be honest with you.
Well, I mean, I feel it somewhat belongs into lifestyle. I mean, you don't have to be an expert in everything to.
No,
just
and
highlight it.
yep. So there are clients of mine that I have that are pursuing it, and I work with those who offer it. But I haven't gotten far into it as far as my own offerings in that space.
Cool.
Can you tell us a little more about PT-141?
Sure. So PT-141 is well, not for brain health. I guess it depends on how you see it. So PT-141 drives sexual health in the sense of increasing partner intimacy, as well as sexual drive and desire, through the release of dopamine and other agents that make the experience more enjoyable. It can be partnered with oxytocin, which we do here as well, and can be given either by sub-Q injections or by nasal sprays. Sometimes, in my practice, I certainly have clients kind of buy it for a weekend couples package, for lack of a better term.
I have another question here, if you don't mind. You can't see me. Sorry about that. Have you considered how personalized these treatments and balancing out can get? Because brain chemistry is very different from one person to another, and we also need to consider atypical frameworks.
Yep. No, absolutely correct. So the best way I would answer that is the personalization is done through ongoing engagement, testing, and how you're responding. Now, that said, nonetheless, we'll do substantial lab work. We will do your cognitive analysis. We do a very deep intake because we want to understand what you're facing. We want to understand with respect to existing issues, right? Do you have a high inflammatory state already? Are there other, as you're kind of calling attention to, perhaps without realizing it, are there a plethora of lifestyle interventions that are underpinning things that will and will not work for you? And very often, despite my desire that everybody optimizes lifestyle first, it's a matter of meeting people where they're at. Because not everyone's capable of getting that 7 hours of sleep every night. They travel for work. I have plenty of clients who on a weekly basis have to eat out. They're entertaining clients. This is just their real world. What can you do for me? So it plays into that as well with respect to the personalization and how we approach it.
Yeah, I also have a question. We are working on AAV gene therapy with BDNF for intranasal administration. What do you think about this approach?
So the peptides that I've seen given by intranasal administration so far have had fairly good receptivity. I will let Dr. Todd talk about it a little bit more, but the biggest hang-up I see with any intranasal peptide is the high potential for user error and variability, whether it's the mucus lining in the nose, whether knowing how to sniff and spray at the exact same time. Are you getting a dose effect that you think you're getting from that perspective is the biggest limiting factor. Very similar to an asthmatic, right? When you first learn to use an albuterol puffer, are you doing it right? Most asthmatics don't at first. It takes quite a bit of practice. So you're losing specificity in your dosing. All right. All right, change it over. Thank you.